Kaufman, and today I'm going to do my IOP and talk a little bit about how historical events, as well as events in Kurt Vonnegut's personal life, influence both Fortitude and Slaughterhouse-Five. So my presentation is the Book of Lies, and by the end of it, you should get why. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk a little bit about him, then I'm going to give you some historical context, and move on to talk about Slaughterhouse and how that fits into all of it, and Fortitude, and then I'm just going to connect everything into this huge mess of a thought process. Alright, so who was Kurt Vonnegut? I'm guessing that most of us, if not all of us, have read Kurt Vonnegut. He was born in 1922 in Indianapolis, and he was really famous for this dark humor that he implemented in his stories, and for how he was critic of society, and how he talked about different problems that we're facing every day, so death and war. Anyways, he had a relatively rough life, especially when it came to death. He lost a lot of people around him, starting with his mother, who committed suicide in 1943. Shortly after that, he was sent to Europe and fought the Battle of the Bulge. He became a prisoner of war, and you know the story because this is the setting of Slaughterhouse. And he experienced the fire bombings in Dresden, where he saw so many people die, and he had the horrific job of burying those bodies and cadavers, and it messes with a person's way of life, seeing that kind of stuff. Then he came back and he decided to pursue the American dream. So he went to college, he got married, he had 3 kids, but that wasn't the end of his suffering. He lost his father, and a year later he lost his sister's husband. 2 days after that, his sister also died, and he adopted their kids. So he ended up with 6 kids. And that's kind of around the time that he was already writing full-time. And he had a really great career. I mean, after the first book that he published, Player's Piano, his career just escalated, and he went on to publish Cat's Cradle, and in 1968, Welcome to the Monkey House, and a year later, Slaughterhouse. After that, he went on to do colleges. He went on to talk to college students about life and problems and politics. He died in 2007 after falling from his apartment. He was 85 years old when he died, so he had a pretty long and eventful life. Alright, so now I'm kind of going to put you guys into the historical time that I want to talk about. I'm going to try and focus between 1945 to 1970s. So around this time, 1945 was the year that Dresden was bombed, and also the year that the World War ended, and he was sent back to the United States. And after that, the 1950s, the start of the Vietnamese War, which is kind of a big deal because by 1968, when Slaughterhouse-Five was published, the Vietnamese War had scaled into a huge problem for the nation. So the 1960s. The 1960s, as the historian posed, were supposed to be the golden age of the United States. Everyone was really excited. Kennedy had just been elected, and everyone loved him. He was young and charming, and they thought it was going to be all good. But by the end of it, it seemed like the nation was broken, and things had just fallen into peace. In 1943, Kennedy was assassinated. More death in his life. And who took over was Lyndon Johnson, who that same year implemented the draft. Now, does anyone know what the draft was? No? Yeah?
Mandatory to go to the army.
Yeah. It was like walking up to someone and being like, Alex, you're going to Vietnam, you don't get to say anything, and you're probably going to die there, even though you're 20. It was horrible. It wasn't something that you wanted or anyone wanted. And at first, there were some exceptions. If you were in college, if you were married, you didn't have to go. But when things got rough, the exceptions went away and people started fleeing to Canada, or all of a sudden there were thousands of college students in the United States. Anyways, and it seems like that's not a big deal right now, but it should be clear to you next slide when I explain how all of this connects to Slaughterhouse Five. Alright, so about Slaughterhouse and the world. Slaughterhouse was obviously impacted by historical events. I mean, it's literally an account of Dresden and the firebombing during the Second World War. But I think it's more interesting to talk about how Slaughterhouse affects the world instead of how the world affects Slaughterhouse. Because Slaughterhouse was published during a war, the Vietnamese War, which, I mean, you're publishing an anti-war book during a war. Now it seems like that's a common thing to do. I mean, why not? That's a good thing. We don't want any more wars. But this book is especially important because it was not only Slaughterhouse, but it was also the Children's Crusades. When people were sent to World War II, they were young, and this was happening all over. The draft was recruiting young people and sending them to Vietnam. This is like history repeating itself, which may be considered a theme of Slaughterhouse. And this, not only this happens, but, I mean, when Kurt Vonnegut wrote, people listened because it wasn't someone saying some nonsense about war. It was someone who had been through the same thing. It was someone who had gone through the same experiences and who was also sent to war at a really young age. I mean, they were sending more baby faces away. And Slaughterhouse wasn't just historical, but it was personal in a way. And that's kind of how I see more of Fortitude, which is the next slide. Fortitude, through my eyes, isn't as much as a historical story as it is personal. I mean, yes, it's fiction, agreed, but there are tiny little elements of that story that just connect to Vonnegut's life in a really special and maybe even tiny and like something that you wouldn't notice, but it's there. In the story was published in 1968, right? That was the year that Vonnegut had suffered from depression and tried to kill himself. For those of you who don't know the story, in Fortitude, the main character, Sylvia Lovejoy, tried to kill herself, failed, so she killed the doctor. But this idea of euthanasia, of taking your own life away, like assisted suicide, and even of not wanting to live anymore, is prevalent in Kurt Vonnegut's life. Someone who commits suicide isn't someone who's happy and, you know, full of life. It's someone who's given up on everything. Someone who doesn't have that will, who has lost a lot of their humanity. And that's what happened with Sylvia Lovejoy in the story. Sylvia Lovejoy, she says that she doesn't want to live anymore. There's no reason why she wants to live anymore. She's no longer a human, but she's a spark of humanity, as they call it. And I think that's kind of what was going on with Vonnegut. But that's not all I see in the story. I also believe my statements because of some small connections to his life, like the Ladies' Home Journal. For those of you who remember, Sylvia was reading the Ladies' Home Journal when she found out about Dr. Little. Now it seems like it's an irrelevant detail, but not that irrelevant when you also remember that someone who loved to read the Ladies' Home Journal was Edith, Kurt Vonnegut's mother, who committed suicide a while before this story was published. I think Kurt Vonnegut not only connects himself to Sylvia Lovejoy, but also as Sylvia Lovejoy is his mother, sort of, in a way, like as a mother figure, is someone he missed, or something that he missed along his life, something that got lost in the way. And that's kind of it. Alright, so I had it, I lost it, guys, I have no idea what I'm talking about, I swear, like, I just don't know, like, it makes no sense. Now, just show of hands, how many of you believe me?
When you're talking about this?
About right now, what I just said right now. You don't, because I'm trying to convince you of something that is so obvious that there's no way you can believe me. Well, this is how I feel about Kurt Vonnegut. I think Kurt Vonnegut doesn't write fiction. I think he writes non-fictitious fiction. I think his stories have fictitious elements. So it has, okay, aliens or Trafalmadorians and tripod heads, but they're actually full of truth behind it. And I believe that, firstly, because of the doubt that he creates. I mean, he opens Slaughterhouse-5 like this. All of this happened, more or less. I mean, if I walked up to you and were like, Lexi, I'm gonna save you, more or less. Would you be trustful that I'm really gonna save you?
Definitely.
I mean, this doesn't mean that Slaughterhouse is full of lies or full of truths, but it means that it's an in-between of truths and lies. And so does Fortitude. I mean, so many events in Fortitude can be related to Vonnegut's life, and I just talked about them. And it's incredible, because once you make this connection, good luck getting over it. And now, every time I go back to it or reread it, I see these things that I just can't believe it. I mean, when Dr. Frankenstein was telling Gloria how he loved Sylvia, he was like, love, more to himself than to her. And then it seems like, okay, it's just two characters talking, but if you think about it in context with all and everything that I just told you, is he really telling himself that? I mean, he's telling that he's only loved two people in his life. His mother, who he couldn't save, connection, and his and Sylvia Lovejoy, which could be connected to either of those. So I believe that Kurt Vonnegut might have tried to do this because sometimes dealing with the world how it is isn't always easy. Going through wars and losses and deaths isn't easy. And the way he did it, so that someone like me who's never experienced death can feel his pain, is just incredible, and it's particular of someone who is telling a personal story and truth. So thank you. This is my IOP.